A soldier would come in with his hand. The doctors treating those frozen soldiers were following the best medical science of their time, and every single thing that science told them to do was making the damage worse. Powder River Country, Wyoming Territory, winter of 1876. Come close on this one, neighbor, because it's a hard one, and I want you to see it clear. The cold that winter did not care what uniform a man wore. Soldiers came into camp with fingers gone the color of candle wax, toes they couldn't feel at all, boots that had to be cut off because the leather had frozen stiff around a foot that no longer had the shape it should. A man would come stumbling in off picket duty smiling half the time because the worst of the pain had already burned off somewhere out on that ground. And smiling was the last thing he should have been doing. The surgeons did exactly what they'd been trained to do. They packed the frozen hands in snow. They kept the men away from the fire, sometimes clear across camp from it, because everybody with a medical certificate to their name believed heat near a frozen limb was the worst thing you could do to it. Slow was safe. Fire was death. That was the rule, and every surgeon on that campaign followed it to the letter, checking each frostbitten hand and foot against the same doctrine, writing the same instructions down, case after case, exactly as they'd been taught to. Picture the inside of that surgeon's tent for a second, neighbor, because it wasn't gentle in there either. Canvas walls snapping in the wind, a lantern burning whale oil or fish oil, whatever the quartermaster could get that far out, throwing off more smoke than light and leaving everything inside smelling faintly of it for days after. The only sound besides the wind was metal. Instruments laid out on a board, picked up, set back down, the scrape of a bowl being filled with snow, packed in from just outside the tent flap. Already gone that waxy white color, and the surgeon would do exactly what the manual told him to do. Pack that hand in snow. Watch the man's face when the cold first touched skin that couldn't feel cold anymore anyway. Then check it again an hour later, 2 hours later, looking for the color to come back slow the way it was supposed to. Some men gritted through it without a sound, because there wasn't much left in that hand to hurt. Others flinched anyway, out of pure instinct, even with the feeling half gone, and every one of them trusted that the man packing snow around their fingers knew exactly what he was doing. He did know, neighbor. That's the part that still gets me every time I sit with this story. He knew his training cold. Forgive the word for it. He just didn't know his training was wrong. Outside that tent, the whole camp was breathing fog into air, too cold to carry it far, horses stamping to keep blood moving in their own legs, and every man on watch doing the same math in his head. How long can I stand here before my own hands start going the way his did? Men who followed that rule to the letter lost fingers, lost toes. Some lost the whole foot weeks later to the black rot that crept in after the swelling went down. Not because the surgeons were careless, neighbor, not because they didn't care, because the doctrine they'd been handed, a doctrine written 60 years earlier by a French army surgeon freezing alongside Napoleon's men in Russia, was already killing tissue that a faster, warmer, simpler method would have saved. And close by that same winter, on that same cold ground, were people who had never read a medical text in their life and had been keeping hands and feet whole through winters like that one for longer than anybody could count. So here's what I want you turning over in your mind tonight. What if the thing you've been taught to do the second your skin goes numb and white is the very thing making sure you lose it? My name is Running Bear Walker, 54 years old, Eastern Band Cherokee, raised in the Smoky Mountains on the ridge my grandfather Thomas Walker never once agreed to leave. I'll say the same thing to you I always say when the story takes me off my own people's ground, neighbor. I'm not Cheyenne. This isn't my nation's knowledge to claim as my own experience. What I'm handing you tonight, I piece together the way I piece together everything I bring you here. My grandfather's journal, elders willing to sit and talk plainly with a Cherokee man about ground and cold that wasn't his, and whatever record still tells the truth of it if you're patient enough to go looking. Sit with me a while. This one might save something of yours one day. Let me tell you what that winter was actually like, because it matters for understanding everything that follows. Wyoming territory in deep winter doesn't ease you into the cold. It drops on you. 40 below some nights, wind cutting sideways across ground with nothing standing up to slow it, and men out on campaign for weeks with wet boots, wet gloves, sleeping wherever the column stopped moving. Frostbite wasn't rare that winter. It was expected. Surgeons on that campaign treated it the way you'd treat a head cold. Routine, common, something you just dealt with as it came. And the doctrine they were working from had a real story behind it, neighbor, which is part of what makes this whole thing so hard to sit with. A French surgeon named Larry, marching with Napoleon's army through the Russian winter of 1812, watched soldiers who crowded close to the campfires to warm their frozen hands come down with gangrene at a far higher rate than the ones who stayed away from the flame and let the cold ease off them slow. Larry wrote that down. He taught it. And for the better part of 140 years, that lesson, slow is safer than fast, cold water and snow instead of fire, held as settled medical fact, taught in every school that trained an army surgeon, including the ones treating soldiers on that Wyoming campaign in 1876. Larry wasn't a fool, and neither were the men who followed him. He'd watched something real happen and drawn a conclusion from it. The trouble is, he drew the wrong conclusion, and nobody checked it against a faster method for well over a century, because once a thing gets written into the doctrine, it stops getting questioned. It just gets taught. Meanwhile, on that same ground, the Cheyenne had been managing cold injury a different way for generations, not through doctrine written in a book, but through watching, close and patient, what actually brought feeling and color back into frozen skin the fastest, with the least damage left behind. Now I want to walk you through what they actually did, neighbor, because it's not complicated, and that's exactly what makes it so easy to miss. The first thing was speed, and it started before the cold ever got bad enough to freeze anything. Elders taught the young ones to watch the skin, not wait for the pain, because that's the trap right there. Frostbite doesn't hurt worse as it gets more dangerous. It goes numb. The pain fades right around the point the damage starts getting serious, and that numbness can feel like relief if you don't know better. A hand that stopped hurting isn't a hand that's fine. A patch of skin gone pale, almost waxy looking, white at the fingertips or the tip of the nose. That's the moment to act, not later, not once it hurts again. And when it was time to act, the method wasn't snow, and it wasn't distance from the fire. It was skin. A frozen hand went straight up under the arm, pressed into the warmth of the body itself, or tucked against bare skin at the belly or the inside of the thigh. Wherever the blood ran closest to the surface and the most heat could pass straight across, person to person if it had to be. No water needed, no fire needed, just the fastest, steadiest heat available, which is almost always another living body standing right next to you. I know that sounds almost too plain to be medicine, neighbor, but plain isn't the same as wrong. That contact warms frozen tissue fast, evenly, without ever getting hot enough to burn skin that's already damaged and can't feel pain warning it away from a flame. And speed, it turns out, is exactly what saves the tissue. Here's the part my grandfather's journal took me longest to understand, and I want to hand it to you plain, without dressing it up. When skin freezes, the water sitting inside every one of those cells turns to ice, and ice takes up more room than water ever did. Those crystals grow sharp edges as they form, and every hour that tissue sits frozen, the crystals keep growing, keep pushing, keep tearing at the thin walls holding each cell together from the inside. Warm that tissue back up slow, and you've just given those crystals more time to do exactly that kind of damage before they finally melt away. Warm it back up fast, and you cut that window of damage down to almost nothing. Slow rewarming was never gentler on that tissue, neighbor. It just stretched the wound out over more hours and called the stretching mercy. And it isn't only the flesh that takes that beating, neighbor. The same crystals tearing through those cells are tearing through the fine threads of feeling running just under the skin. The very lines that would normally scream at you the second something's wrong. That's a big part of why frostbite fools people twice. First, it goes numb, because those lines of feeling are already damaged and can't send the warning through anymore. Then, once you finally do warm it back up, the pain that comes roaring back isn't the feeling of new harm starting. It's what's left of that feeling waking back up and reporting everything that already happened while you couldn't sense a thing. There was a second piece, too, one that started long before any hand ever got dangerously cold. Grease, worked into the exposed skin of the face and hands before a hard ride or long hunt in bitter weather. Bear fat, sometimes, or fat rendered down from other game. Worked in thick at the cheekbones, the nose, the backs of the hands, anywhere the wind was going to find bare skin and take the heat straight off it. It wasn't just for the feel of it, and it wasn't ceremony. That grease worked the fight from a different angle than warmth alone ever could. It didn't stop the cold from being cold. What it did was keep the wind from stripping heat off bare skin as fast as it otherwise would, the same way a good coat keeps a fire's warmth close instead of letting it scatter into the night air. Skin left bare in a hard wind loses heat faster than any body can make it back. That's the whole equation, neighbor. Grease never added 1 degree of heat. It just slowed down how fast the body was allowed to lose the heat it already had. Simple, cheap, done before the cold ever became a problem instead of after. Because by the time skin's already gone white and numb, you're not preventing the injury anymore, neighbor. You're just managing how bad it gets. And there was a third piece, quieter than the other two, and just as important. Movement. A frost-bitten hand or foot, once it was warmed, stayed active. Fingers worked, toes wiggled, feet kept moving as soon as movement was possible again, because blood that's circulating is blood doing the work of healing. A limb left still and wrapped tight. The way you might think to protect it out of caution can actually slow that recovery down, because healing tissue needs fresh blood, reaching it as much as it needs warmth. The people who'd lived through generations of winters on that ground understood something a lot of well-meaning caution misses even now. Stillness isn't always the same thing as safety. Sometimes stillness is just a slower kind of harm, dressed up to look like care. Speed, skin, grease before the cold, movement after. 4 pieces, and every one of them stands directly against what those Army surgeons were doing that winter in Wyoming territory. Now here's the part that ought to sit heavy with you, neighbor, because it isn't really a story about ignorance. It's a story about how hard it is to question something once it's written down as fact. When a doctor packed a frozen hand in snow and moved that soldier away from the fire, He wasn't guessing. He was following. Instruction passed down through decades of formal medical training, built on real observation from a real war, taught by respected men to other respected men in exactly the kind of institution built to be trusted. That's what makes this one different from a story about carelessness. Nobody in that Wyoming winter camp was cutting corners. They were doing exactly what they'd been told was correct by people whose entire job was knowing what was correct. And the tragedy sitting underneath that, neighbor, is how long that mistake was allowed to stand, simply because nobody with the authority to change the textbook ever sat with someone practicing a faster, better method and asked why it worked. It would take until well into the next century before medicine finally proved, formally, in a laboratory, that fast rewarming saves more tissue than slow ever did. Generation after generation of soldiers, settlers, and travelers losing fingers and toes that a faster method, sitting right there the whole time in the villages some of them marched past, could have saved. That's not a story about one side being smart and the other being foolish. It's a story about what happens when knowledge only gets trusted once it comes wearing the right coat and carries the right title. The Cheyenne weren't running experiments in a lab. They were watching, generation after generation, what actually worked on real bodies in real cold. And that kind of watching, patient and unwritten, doesn't carry weight with an institution built to trust paper over people. My grandfather used to bring up the Army Scouts when this subject came up. Neighbor, the native trackers and guides who rode with campaigns just like that one, paid by the same Army, whose surgeons were packing frozen hands in snow a tent away. Those scouts knew that country better than any officer riding beside them ever would, knew the weather turning before the sky showed it, knew which draws still held water, and which ones would kill a horse looking for it, knew 100 things about staying alive out there that never once made it into a single Army manual. And still, when it came to a soldier's frozen hand, the doctrine in that surgeon's tent came from a book written decades earlier in France, not from the man riding point who'd spent his whole life reading that exact same ground. That's not because the scouts didn't know better, neighbor. It's because the Army had a system for deciding whose knowledge counted as medicine, and knowledge that didn't arrive wearing a uniform of its own kind mostly never made it past the tent flap. So let's put the whole thing together plain, the way it should have been taught from the start. Watch skin, act fast, use warmth, keep moving. That's the whole method, neighbor. Simple enough to teach a child, and it took the official record generations to catch up to what it was already worth. Here's what I want you carrying with you the next time cold weather turns dangerous, whether that's you or somebody standing next to you. The second skin goes numb and pale. Don't wait for pain to tell you something's wrong, because pain is exactly what won't be there. Check faces and hands on anybody out in hard cold with you, neighbor, not just your own. Frostbite creeps up on a nose or a cheek quiet enough that a man can be losing tissue and not know it because he can't see his own face the way somebody standing next to him can. Get that skin against warm skin as fast as you safely can, under an arm, against a belly, pressed to another person's palm. If you've got access to it, warm water works too, body temperature or just a little above, never hot enough to burn skin that can't feel a burn coming yet. Test it against your own wrist first, the way you'd test water for a baby, because a hand that's frozen numb will trust a temperature that's already doing damage. No rubbing, no packing it in snow, no standing back from a fire out of some old fear that heat is the enemy here. It never was the enemy. Slow was. And once feeling starts coming back, keep that hand moving, keep those toes working, even though it's going to hurt worse before it hurts better. That pain coming back is the sound of the damage stopping, not the sound of new damage starting. One more thing worth carrying, neighbor, because it trips people up every winter. If there's any chance that hand or foot might refreeze before you reach real shelter, if you're still an hour from a warm building, still hours from anywhere the cold can't follow you back in, don't warm it yet. A limb that thaws and then freezes again takes worse damage than one left frozen a little longer and thawed properly once, all the way through, one time only. That's a hard thing to sit with in the moment, wanting so badly to bring the warmth back the second you can. But warming it halfway, out in weather that's going to take it back, does more harm than good ever could. Now let me tell you what sits under all of this, because it's bigger than frostbite. We built a whole world that trusts a diploma over a grandmother. Not because the grandmother is usually wrong, neighbor. Plenty of the time, she's exactly right. Sooner and cheaper and gentler than the version that eventually makes it into a textbook. We trust the diploma because it comes with an institution behind it, and admitting that institution was wrong cost somebody something. A career built on the old doctrine, a reputation staked on teaching it faithfully. That is not evil, neighbor. That is just what fear of being wrong does to people who built their whole life on being right. That's not a conspiracy, neighbor. Larry wasn't hiding the truth from anybody, and neither were the surgeons who followed him. That's just what happens when knowledge only travels one direction, from the university down to the frontier, and never once travels back the other way, from the people who'd already solved the problem, up to the people writing the books. My grandfather, Thomas, used to tell me that the mountain doesn't care what letters come after a man's name. It only cares whether he paid attention. The Cheyenne paid attention, winter after winter, on ground that punished any mistake, fast and permanently. And that kind of proof is harder to argue with than anything written up in a journal article. Neighbor, there's no second try when the ground you're testing your knowledge on is 40 below and doesn't forgive. That's what I'm handing back to you tonight, not because I think a hard winter is coming for you tomorrow, because somewhere, some year, cold is going to test somebody you love, and what you do in the first 60 seconds after that skin goes pale is going to matter more than anything a doctor tells them 3 hours later. I'd rather you carry this and never need a single word of it than need it once and not have it, neighbor. That's the whole reason my grandfather sat me down with that journal in the first place. Tell me something before you go, neighbor. Did anybody ever teach you what to actually do the moment skin goes numb in the cold? Or is tonight the first time anybody's laid it out plain for you? Put it in the comments. The story that pulls the most of you in is the one I go deep on next. Hit subscribe if you're new here. Not for me. For the knowledge we keep pulling back into the light on this channel, you're going to want to be here for the next one. Next time, the shelter method that kept Cherokee families alive at 20 below zero with no stove, no electricity, and nothing but what the mountain gave them.